Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode will be an interview about Daoism and Mohism with Wai-Wai Chiu from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Hello, Wai-Wai.
Hi, Peter. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's so good to have you. We were just saying before we started the recording that you are actually a student of Karen Lai's, my co-author.
Yes.
So when was that?
I think it's around the same time when the podcast began.
Oh, wow. Okay. So about 15 years
you can
ago.
ask Karen for details.
Yeah, we'll see who has the better memory. Okay, good. So you're someone who's interacted with Karen, and we're going to be talking about an interaction here, namely between Daoism and Mohism, and in particular, not just Daoism in general, but really the Zhuangzi, which is the text we've been covering here on the podcast. And so I'm wondering, just to get us going, what evidence is there that there actually was any interaction between them so that the authors of the Zhuangzi were aware of the Mohists or that the Mohists were aware of the Zhuangzi?
So since the Zhuangzi text itself, it mentions the names Ruis and Mohists lots of times, along with their key ideas and doctrines. So we can safely claim that whoever wrote the Zhuangzi is pretty much an anthology, by the way, must be familiar with the key doctrines of Mohism. On the other side, the early Mohists were probably active before the Zhuangzi show up on the stage, so they would not know the content of the Zhuangzi. But for the later Mohists, although the canons, they are obscure and consisting of fragments, we can see that they were familiar with the topics discussed by thinkers like Gongsun Long or whoever were interested in the art of disputation. For example, in the Mohist canons, you see they also analyze the infamous paradox that white horse is not a horse. So what is the nature of compound terms like white horse? The later Mohists also criticized some doctrines very close to what the Zhuangzi claims, if not identical. For example, they said that whoever thought that there is no winner in a disputation cannot be right. This echoes a passage found in chapter 2 of the Zhuangzi, which questions the meaning of winning a disputation, and in particular whether disputation or argumentation is really a reliable process of determining right and wrong. So, although the vague and cryptic writings of both texts prevent us from saying exactly certainly that the authors know each other, but at least we can say that they are fully aware of something similar to their opponent's view.
Right. And that's actually a really nice illustration of the importance of the kind of strange construction of the Mozi, which has this big opening part, which is, I think, the part people most like to read, with the threefold chapters, the triads, and so on. And then there's this later section by the later Mohists, and that covers these logical linguistic issues. So we dealt with those separately in different episodes. The listeners will hopefully remember that.
Yeah,
and
correct.
So what you're saying is that the later Mohists know about the Zhuangzi, the early Mohists don't, and the Zhuangzi is aware of Mohism because it actually explicitly refers to Mohism.
Yes.
Okay, great. So one thing that I think we need to start with in talking about language in the dispute between these two schools, which is really what we're going to focus on here, is the notion of the Tao, because something else we looked at a few episodes ago when we were talking about the Lao Tzu. In the Lao Tzu, it says, or it seems to say, that the Tao is unnameable, unknowable, ineffable, something like that.
Yeah.
What does that mean, according to you?
Right. I think the Zhuangzi sometimes overlaps with the Tao Te Ching, but sometimes it also has its unique idea. But this is such a good question that touches upon so many dimensions of Daoist philosophy. But of course, we are focusing on the issue of language here. The mystical tone is surely one reason why the Zhuangzi or Daoism in general is both attractive and frustrating. It is common to see that books and videos emphasize this tone to make it more exotic, I would say. So sometimes this is an image built up for promotion. But in the Zhuangzi, of course, you really do see passages saying that something like language is insufficient for grasping or transmitting Tao, which I take it as the most important part of our lives. Okay. But why? I would mention two brief reasons here. One reason has to do with the relationship between language and reality, because this is a central question for the later Mohists, right? So that they're obsessed with how or why language can refer to something and why it succeeds or not in doing that. So, well, Platonic philosophy argues that what is real must be unchanging, and Taoism thinks quite the opposite. All things simply change. Ultimate reality is just change itself. But language tends to solidify things. It makes us feel that things are more solid than they really are. For example, while actual cats run and play and die, by developing an idea of cat, we seem to step into a zone where the object of our thought is static because the idea itself, well, does not run or die, right? So language gives us the impression, a misleading one, of reality. This is the first reason. The second reason has to do with the very central meaning of Tao is a path, right? So by following Tao, we are taking a path to navigate our lives. So the term Tao can be used as a noun or a verb. So you may say that pursuing Tao is sometimes the same as seeking guidance. The Zhuangzi is quite skeptical about whether language is always the most reliable form of giving guidance. Sometimes we listen to others' advice, sometimes we do it in a monologue, especially for philosophers, but sometimes we just see and respond, and sometimes we rely on body memory. So verbal competence is not always necessary. When I'm teaching, I always tell my students to think of cases in sports or art, or even the subtleties of human interaction. We must know how to attune ourselves to the situation without always pausing and posing arguments. The Mohists are not very happy about this Taoist vision, of course.
That does seem pretty much diametrically opposed to what the Mohists would say, because they think that we do have the ability to fix the reference of words. I mean, maybe we shouldn't deal with such an advanced concept as Dao. Let's take this typical example of horse. So we have this word horse, and horse refers to something out in the world, and we can give criteria for applying the word horse. If we apply it to a cow, then we're making a mistake. If we apply it to horse, we're getting things right. That seems like a pretty intuitive idea, right? So is that basically what the Mohists are trying to achieve with their philosophy of language?
I would say the Mohist view is closer to our common sense, actually. Naming a thing horse implies that this thing in front of me is similar to other things that are also called horse. And for the Mohist, there should be clear and objective standard about what can be named horse and what cannot. So the Mohists think that although things can change, of course, certain relationships among things remain constant. For example, all circles are similar to each other and not similar to squares. A round object can, of course, change to a square object, but the similarity among circles and their dissimilarity with squares remain the same. If that's acceptable, that would mean reality contains some stable basis on which we can construct our language accordingly. To the extent that our language captures at least part of the stable relationship among things, truth or Tao is not ineffable. And it is knowable too. It is not difficult to train someone to discover certain patterns in the world. In fact, here, I would say the later Mohists, think that the Taoists implicitly assume that the world is knowable when they claim that language may fail to capture reality. For the Mohists would say, if you, the Taoists, really know nothing about reality, how can you decide whether something can capture it or not? So the Mohists would also accuse the Taoists of shamelessly bringing forth a contradiction. If Tao is really ineffable, then pretty much all linguistic expressions will fail to grasp it, or at least fail to communicate it. But how about this expression itself? Does it also fail to communicate the Tao? If so, then why should we listen to it? Why should we take this advice? And if you say, oh no, this expression is special, that somehow it does not fail, then of course we will ask why. The Taoists should give us a reason. But if they are able to give a reason, no matter what it is, then the Tao is not totally ineffable after all.
If I remember rightly, something you mentioned before, which is that issue and that's mentioned by the later Mohists about whether it's possible to win a dispute. There's a similar kind of self-refutation argument that they use there, right? So if someone says it's not possible to win disputes, you can say, well, okay, let's have a dispute about that, about whether it's possible to win disputes. And of course, the Taoists will undermine their own position because they'll try to win this dispute concerning whether or not disputes can be won or not, right?
Yes, and the later Mohists would also say that sometimes the Taoists appear to engage in a self-contradicting activity, namely criticizing criticism. That's the word that they're using. So if you criticize criticism to an extreme, that means all criticism should be criticized, but you are criticizing yourself as well. So it does not get us anywhere by claiming this weird stuff. That's why in the public arena, Taoists seldom appears in front of the Louis and Mohists. They just in the corner and do their stuff. And that's why the term Taoism does not refer to an organized school, right? By organizing a school, of course, you rely on language, right?
Yeah, so it would be strange to like get involved in a public debate when you think that there's no such thing as winning public debates, for sure. I think also the point you made about how the Mohists would understand the application of a word like horse, where they say, well, all we're doing here is taking advantage of the similarity between these different objects, which we're calling horses, and we're going to use horse for anything that's relevantly similar. That also evades the implicit criticism you mentioned before when you were talking about the example of cat, where, you know, we don't believe in cat with a capital C that's unchanging and so on, right? Like a Platonic form of cat, as you mentioned. But the Mohists don't seem to be committed to anything like that. They're just saying, well, there's this class of similar objects, right? And we can call them all horse.
Here, I would like to add a point that Zhuangzi likes to poke fun at this idea of putting objects into different categories, so to speak. As I've mentioned, in common sense, we think that the Mohists are clearly right? So horses mean a group of similar animals that are horses. Now let us consider something more abstract, but still very common in our daily lives, what we call indexicals. We use indexicals every day. These include, for example, demonstrative pronouns like this or that. I can call the microphone in front of me this. I can also call the computer in front of me this. I can even, in some contexts, I can even call myself this. Now, is there any similarity among the microphone, the computer, and my person? Doesn't seem to be, because in fact, I can call anything by the term this as long as I stand close enough to that object. Does this imply that everything in the world belongs to the same category and share an attribute of thisness? Now, things are getting weird now. The Zhuangzi would say that now you see, not every term can be defined in this way. Some terms, their meanings keep changing, their reference keep shifting. But the Zhuangzi also goes a step further and implies that ordinary terms are not that different from indexicals. So the Zhuangzi says something like heaven and earth are just one finger and the 10,000 things are just one horse. What does it mean? Well, I think he's trying to convey a message that a finger can be similar to many things. It can be like a thumb. It can be like a piece of biscuit. It can be like a sign. If you use a little bit more imagination, you can construct metaphors to hint at even more things. So a finger can be put into different groups of things depending on the context. This contextual nature of language is highlighted and often played with in the Zhuangzi.
Yeah, I like that passage about using a hollowed out gourd as a boat. So the word gourd turns out to apply to boat or vice versa. And the narrow-minded person is the person who can't see that the word boat would apply to a gourd and vice versa. At least that would be one way of thinking about it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I think I'm struck by the fact that, in a way, both the Mohist views and the Zhuangzi's views take their plausibility from the examples they're starting with. So if you start with horse, then it's very attractive to think that the Mohists are right. But if you start with the word this, then it's very attractive to think that the Zhuangzi is right, because of course the word this can refer to just anything, right? And I guess the question is whether we should be trying to get the way the word horse works to govern our expectations about how all of language works, or whether we should be taking a word like this and using that as a model for how all of language works. And that's maybe the core of the dispute between them, right?
Yeah, and in both tests, you can see that they are trying to provide additional reasons for supporting their view. For example, the Mohists, perhaps they have access to something similar to Zhuangzi's idea. They try to solve this problem by strictly divide different levels of reference and differentiate between literal and non-literal usage of a term. So let me capture this briefly. There are some terms that refer universally. For example, the term thing, and anything can be a thing. There are also terms that refer what the Mohists call privately. For example, my name, Wai-Wai. It points to a specific individual, regardless of any qualities of that individual. You cannot say that if there's another person also named Wai-Wai, that person will share some attributes with me. No, it's just a name for pointing to me. So when you use a universal term or a private term, there's no need to care about whether the term refers to some objective characteristics by which things can be put into categories. In other words, issue of similarity does not arise here. So the Mohists can say that, okay, if you want to play with words like this or that, well, this term works like the term thing is a universal term. So yeah, of course, the issue of similarity does not arise here. You can use it whatever you want. But the Mohists say that most of the terms we use in daily life are what they call kind terms. So the problem of indexicals exists because the Zhuangzi tries to apply the rationale of universal terms to kind terms, which is a confusion, actually. Furthermore, the Mohists differentiate between literal and non-literal usage of a term. When you use a term literally, you must refer to something like a thing's shape, motion, or mathematical qualities, which are objective. And if you are trying to come up with examples like metaphors or symbolic meanings, the Mohists will say, oh, this is not the normal usage of the term. So by making these finer distinctions, they are trying to combat the problems created by the Daoists.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good response. So in a way, that boils down to the point that whereas the Taoists may be claiming that everything works like an indexical, like this or that, the Mohists are not committed to the idea that all words work like horse, because they would admit indexicals don't work like horse, or the word thing doesn't work like the word horse, because there's no relevant similarity that everything shares in common, to which we can call thing. Can I ask you about another widely used phrase in classical Chinese philosophy, which is about language, which is the rectification of names? So this is something that both the Mohists and the Confucians, or the Ruists, are interested in. What would the Taoists say about that project of rectifying names? So would they, for example, say that the Confucians have their way of trying to make names refer rigidly to things, and the Mohists have their contrary way of making words refer rigidly to things, and that's just why they wind up disagreeing all the time? But that what we should do is step back from this whole project of rectifying names? Or is there some way of rectifying names that would also make sense from a Taoist point of view?
This is such a good question, but it's also a very grand question. Well, for the early Confucians like Zhuangzi, pretty much the project of rectification of names is about rectifying people's behavior through the names. So for a fairly obvious example is the term "zi" in the Rui's text, which is a well-educated person, usually come from the upper class. The Rui's use this term to refer to a virtuous person, sometimes even regardless of the person's social background. And the Mohists use this term in a more traditional way. It simply refers to people from the upper class with a special dressing code and speech style. Etymologically, the Chinese character Jun in Zhuangzi consists of two parts, a scepter, symbolizing power, and a mouth, symbolizing order. So etymologically, Jun is someone who has power and can give order. But why do Ruiz use the term Junzi to refer to not just people with high social status, but also people with high level of moral cultivation? Well, in restricting the term to virtuous people, the Ruiz are implicitly suggesting that only virtuous people deserve to have power. So obviously, the issue of naming has political consequences. The Mohists believe that the most reliable standard for morality and politics is heaven itself. Power is not backed up by any human being's virtue alone, be it Junzi or anyone else. In fact, they think that the Ruiz too quickly associate power with virtue or upper class virtue. So the Mohists criticize them for failing to see that the legitimacy of power comes from objective standards. Now, when we step into later Mohism, the debate becomes more complex. The later Mohist insistence on defining terms by the objective characteristic of their reference, where Ruiz define terms by cultural consensus. Allow me to use a modern term cup as an example. What is a cup? For the later Mohists, a cup is defined by its capacity to hold a certain amount of liquid and by its shape being fitting to human beings' hands. It's very scientific oriented, so to speak. But for Ruiz, they would say a cup is defined by its role in society. For instance, as a vessel in rituals, in dining tables. This time it is the Ruiz who side with the tradition in defining what names we should assign to the tools and accessories around us. I use a more modernized example in my class. Let's consider the term tomatoes, for example. Should we name tomatoes as fruits? Or should we name them as vegetables? Well, if you are being scientific, you may say that, well, technically a tomato has seeds, so from a botanical perspective, it should be classified under the name fruit. That's true, but at least in Hong Kong, where I live, if I order a fruit cake or a glass of fruit punch, I don't want to see tomatoes in my dessert or a drink.
And if you go into a store and you're not going to find the tomatoes in the fruit section, you're going to find it in the vegetable section.
So you can see that there are two different naming systems for classifying and distinguish things. And they have a part of, you might say, theoretical interest, but they also have serious political consequences as well.
Presumably the Daoists would really emphasize that fact, right? That there's a kind of maybe arbitrariness or flexibility in the way that we use different words to apply to different things. And so the way we're using language is always going to be an expression of our interests or our priorities or our goals. And so this whole project of rectifying names that the Mohists and Confucians were committed to, where you just wind up with one correct naming practice or set of naming practices, they would reject that as impossible. Is that right?
Yes. For the descriptive project, that is a theoretical part, Zhuangzi would play with indexicals, and what I would say in a while, he would emphasize something like a body experience in order to bypass the guiding power of language. And for the political part, you are right in saying that Zhuangzi thinks sometimes people are just putting up their self-interest or their own agenda as if it is the only correct form of how we conduct the management of society. Here's a story in the Zhuangzi. A king is reading a book, and one of his craftsmen, a wheelwright, a person who makes wheels for cars, comes and asks the king, "What are you reading?" The king replies by saying, "The words of sages." "Okay, are those sages alive?" "No, they are dead." "Well, in this case, my lord, you are just reading Dress of the Ancients." Now the king becomes angry and demands explanation, otherwise he will execute the wheelwright. The wheelwright then starts talking about his experience of making wheels. If the spokes are loose, they may fit, but the wheel won't be solid. If the spokes are too tight, you won't be able to insert them in the first place. So you have to make them neither too loose nor too tight. But this is something you get from your hand experience to feed your heart. It's not something that you can directly transmit to another person. So the wheelwright cannot convey this knack to his son, and he has to continue to his business till his 70s. So from this story, we can get several points. For example, the secret of success is to strike the balance in everything. But the balance point is always hard to catch. It is the point at which two opposites cancel each other and fuse into harmony. And it can't be described in a straightforward manner. It is always something like not too fast, not too slow, or not too hard, not too soft, things like that. You try to spot the balance between two opposites by paying attention to your body experience, not the idea in your head. And then something about book. Words and theories may be able to show that people in the past achieved certain things, but we should not take them as rigid standards or formulas. This is because the contextual nature I've just mentioned. People in the past have their skill fit their context, but our skill should fit our context. The Zhuangzi actually thinks that too much description prevents one from being absorbed in the context. Spontaneous performance requires one to forget about instructions. So think of sports. Beginners often have to remind themselves about what their coaches tell them, like raise your hands in this way, put your feet in that way. Their mind is full of rules, but their action is clumsy. Masters don't need to do this when they are playing. They only give descriptions retrospectively, not in the moment when they, for example, hit the ball. So the Zhuangzi would here question the value of language as a form of guidance.
These are actually examples and themes we'll be coming back to in a few episodes ago, as we're going to look at the skill stories in the Zhuangzi, and the wheelwright is a famous example of that idea that you can't put into words what the skilled person is able to do. That's a particularly good example, as you mentioned, that scene, because the contrast is there in the book that the king is reading. So the book is useless, at least for what the wheelwright is supposed to be able to do.
Right.
So we're coming to an end now. Just before we finish, I wanted to maybe give you a chance to broaden out what we've been talking about and maybe say something about how these themes around language relate to other aspects of Taoism and the Zhuangzi. Like you mentioned that it has these political implications. Is there more you want to say about that, or how language connects to their views on knowledge or other themes?
Let me first talk about knowledge. As I've said, the Mohists claim that there are reliable standards for judging whether something is the case or something is not the case. They also describe 3 ways of acquiring knowledge, namely testimony, you hear something from others; inference, you do a reasoning by yourself; or experience, you see something in the first-person perspective. So they also think that it is essential to find a stable basis for knowledge. When we acquire knowledge, we need to use our intellect to explain it so that we know how a piece of knowledge is connected to other pieces of knowledge, resulting in a grand picture of things. So we can see that explanation, or the ability of using words, is very important here. While the early Mohist is primarily concerned with practical affairs, the later Mohist come to reflect on the nature of practice and propose that a certain degree of linguistic and logical competence is essential for practical knowledge as well. On the other hand, the Zhuangzi often ponders the limit of human knowledge. Do we, as tiny human beings, really have the ability to draw definite conclusions about ourselves or the world? The Zhuangzi says knowledge always depends on something in order to fit. Depends on what? My interpretation is that it depends on criteria. We must have criteria to differentiate between knowing and not knowing, like how well our beliefs are justified, whether our practice is reliable, etc., etc. How about the legitimacy of these criteria? Can we provide justification for them as well? Would this trigger infinite regrets? And what if these criteria themselves conflict with each other? What can settle the conflict? The famous butterfly dream in the text, in which I think many people have read it sometime in their lives, in which the historical figure associated with the text Zhuangzi dreams that he's a butterfly, free, delighted. But then suddenly, Zhuangzi wakes up and sees that he's a human doing podcasts. Or is it? Could it be that he's really the butterfly and this human experience is transitional? This sounds like epistemological skepticism, but it is a little bit different from, for example, Descartes' meditation, because the Zhuangzi does not seem to think that not knowing our true identity is a problem. He's not chasing after Archimedean point, so to speak. Quite the opposite, he's suggesting that, well, maybe this not knowing is perfectly normal and we should just let it be.
Right.
Yeah,
so as with language, or the Daoist or Zhuangzi say, well, maybe you should just make peace with the fact that your words aren't going to have this fixed relationship to the rest of the world. So here he would say, well, don't get so worried about whether your way of seeing the world is getting it exactly right, because maybe there is no one way to get the world exactly right.
It can also link back to the example you mentioned at the beginning, the gold and the boat. The Zhuangzi would say, oh, you are treating words like gold. So it is fixed, it's a solid. It can just have a function like this and that. But how about if you turn it into a boat that you can become free flow on the rivers and enjoy your life, although you are not knowing exactly where you will go, but that will be fine.
Yeah, so maybe actually skepticism is too negative a way of thinking about it, and we should think about it more in terms of creativity. Like, well, maybe here's a different way of thinking about it, right? Maybe you're a butterfly, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, on that positive note, I will invite the listeners all to imagine that they're butterflies and flutter around Wai-Wai Chiu to thank him for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
And they can also imagine themselves checking out the next episode, in which we will continue to talk about the Zhuangzi here on the history of philosophy in China.